Daniel had always believed some houses were alive. His childhood home on Maplewood Lane wasn't just a building. It breathed with memories. The creak of the wooden staircase, the faint scratches on the kitchen counter where his mother rolled dough, the roses blooming, along the porch planted by his fathers. Rough hands, all of it told a story of love, struggle, and family. For Daniel, this house wasn't just shelter. It was the final piece of his parents' legacy, the place where laughter had once filled, the air and where silence now carried their echoes. That's why the letter in his mailbox that Monday morning felt like a strike to the heart. At first, he thought it was just another community newsletter from the HOA, but the bold, black print on the envelope froze him in place, violation notice. He tore it open and scanned the words. The HOA accused him of multiple infractions. His lawn was not the correct shade of green, his shutters were out of compliance, and even his mailbox did not meet community standards. The letter ended with a chilling warning. Non-compliance would lead to fines of $100 per day, escalating if ignored. Daniel blinked at the paper, convinced it had to be a mistake. His lawn was trimmed, his flowers were neat, and his shutters had been painted by his late mother years ago. They weren't just blue, they were her blue, chosen after days of mixing paints until she found the shade she loved. How could something so personal be deemed a violation? Determined to clear things up, Daniel walked to the HOA office that afternoon. The boardroom smelled of coffee and polish, its walls lined with photos of approved homes, identical lawns, matching shutters, cookie-cutter designs. Sitting across the table, a board member barely glanced at Daniel before saying, "Your grass doesn't match the required shade. It's too dull." Another chimed in, "Your shutters need to be replaced. Non-standard colors bring down neighborhood value." Their tone was clipped, official, and completely detached from the reality of what they were saying. Daniel tried to explain. He told them about his mother's shutters, his father's roses, the care he took every week to maintain the yard. But the board's faces remained unmoved, like stone. Finally, the chairperson leaned forward and said coldly, "Rules are rules. If you can't comply, we'll fine you until you do." That night, Daniel sat on the porch, staring at the roses his father had planted. The blooms were beginning to open, their petals catching the soft glow of the streetlight. To the HOA, they were just flowers that didn't fit the mold. But to Daniel, they were proof that this home was more than property. It was memory, history, love. The notices didn't stop. They arrived almost daily, each one harsher than the last. First $100 a day, then $250, then $500. Within weeks, the bills piled so high that Daniel couldn't ignore the truth. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were trying to force him out. One evening, his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Green, shuffled across the yard with her cane. Her eyes carried a sadness Daniel hadn't noticed before. "They did this to my son," she whispered. "Fined him until he couldn't fight anymore. He had to sell, Daniel. They want your house. They always target the ones who hold on to the old homes." Her voice cracked, and she gave his arm a gentle squeeze. "Don't let them take yours." Her words hit Daniel like a hammer. Suddenly, all the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't about grass, shutters, or mailboxes. It was about control. The HOA wanted to shape the neighborhood into their perfect vision, even if it meant erasing families who had been there for generations. That night, Daniel wandered through the house, every step heavy with memory. He paused at the pencil marks on the hallway wall where his mother had measured his height as a boy. He touched the banister his father had polished smooth. He ran his fingers over the initials he and his sister had carved into the window frame of his bedroom. Each memory whispered the same truth. This wasn't just a house. It was his family's soul carved into wood and stone. He couldn't sell, he wouldn't. Sitting at the kitchen table with only the dim light above him, Daniel pulled out a notebook. For a long time, the page remained blank as he stared at it, heart pounding with anger and determination. Then, slowly, he began to write. Ideas turned into plans, plans into strategies. If the HOA wanted a fight, they would get one. But it wouldn't be the fight they expected. Daniel wasn't just going to defend his home, he was going to outsmart them, expose them, and turn their own power against them. As the night stretched into morning, Daniel closed the notebook and looked out the window. The sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the oak tree in his yard with shades of gold. The same oak tree under which he had promised his parents years ago that he would never let the house go. He clenched his jaw and whispered to himself, "They think they can break me, but they don't know what I have planned." And in that moment, Daniel knew the battle for his childhood home had only just begun. The days that followed were some of the longest Daniel had ever lived. Each morning, the sharp thud of an envelope in his mailbox felt like the pounding of a war drum. More notices, more fines. Each letter carried the same sterile language, but Daniel had begun to see the intent hiding between the lines. They weren't warning him anymore. They were cornering him. But Daniel refused to let fear dictate his choices. The notebook he had started in frustration quickly turned into his lifeline. Page after page filled with ideas, legal loopholes, ways to involve the community, even ways to turn the very history of his home into a shield the HOA couldn't break. Every word on those pages carried the same promise he had whispered beneath the oak tree. He wasn't giving up. He started small, reaching out to neighbors he thought might understand. His first stop was Mr. Alvarez, a retired carpenter who had lived down the street for decades. When Daniel showed him the violation letters, Mr. Alvarez's weathered face tightened. "Your father and I built those shutters together," he said, his voice thick with memory. "And now they call them non-compliant? That's not just wrong, it's insulting." Encouraged, Daniel visited others. At Mrs. Green's home, she handed him an old photograph, showing his parents hosting a block party in their yard, children laughing under the oak tree strung with lights. The Thompsons, who had moved in years later, offered a stack of flyers his mother had made for community events in the barn. Even families who hadn't known his parents well shared stories they'd heard, how Daniel's father had helped neighbors repair fences after a storm, or how his mother baked pies for anyone who was going through hard times. Piece by piece, Daniel was gathering proof that his home wasn't a violation of community standards. It was the very definition of community. Still, the HOA wasn't blind to his efforts. One evening, as Daniel returned from another visit, he found Ms. Calloway, the HOA chairwoman, standing on his porch. Her blazer was crisp, her smile thin, her clipboard clutched like a weapon. "Mr. Carson," she said smoothly, "I hear you've been rallying people. I must remind you, the board's decisions are final. Rules are rules." Daniel stood his ground. Rules should protect people, not erase them. For a flicker of a moment, her eyes narrowed, revealing a crack in her calm mask. Then she regained her composure. 20 days remain. After that, foreclosure begins. Do what you like until then. But it won't change the outcome. She turned sharply and walked away, the sound of her heels clicking against the pavement like a countdown clock. Her words haunted him that night, but instead of breaking his resolve, they sharpened it. He opened his notebook and added a new section at the top of the page. Plan B. Plan B was bolder, riskier, but necessary. He would transform the ranch into something larger than himself, something the HOA couldn't touch. If they wanted to call his home a problem, he would prove it was a treasure. The barn became his first focus. Dusty beams, peeling paint, and creaky floorboards made it look like nothing more than an old storage space. But Daniel saw what it had been, and what it could be again. With his neighbor's help, he scrubbed floors, repaired boards, and painted walls. Mr. Alvarez arrived with his tools, fixing what time had worn down. The Thompsons brought their teenage kids, who strung up lights across the rafters. Mrs. Green, despite her cane, sat in a chair nearby, handing out sandwiches and telling stories of the barn, dances she remembered from years ago. As the barn slowly came back to life, so did the community. People who hadn't spoken in years found themselves laughing together, trading stories, rediscovering what it meant to be neighbors. And Daniel felt something stirring deep inside him. A quiet strength that came not just from his own determination but from the support of those around him. But the HOA's pressure didn't ease. The next week, a certified letter arrived, Official hearing scheduled. In bold letters, it declared that the board would convene in 10 days to decide whether Daniel's home was to be fined into foreclosure. The envelope trembled in his hands as he read it. This was no longer distant. The battle had a date. That night, Daniel sat on the porch beneath the oak tree. The branches stretched above him like arms protecting the land, casting long shadows in the moonlight. He thought of his parents, his childhood, and every memory carved into the house around him. Doubt crept in. Could he really win against an entire board with lawyers and money? Was he strong enough? But then he remembered the faces of his neighbors, the way Mrs. Green had gripped his arm, the way Mr. Alvarez had stood proud, the laughter of the kids hanging lights in the barn. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was theirs, too. Daniel closed his eyes, letting the night air steady him. He thought of the oak tree, rooted deep into the earth, unmoved by storms or seasons. That was what he needed to be, unbending, unshakable. When he opened his eyes again, the doubt was gone. In its place was resolve. The HOA thought they had cornered him, but they didn't know the truth. They didn't know about the history he had uncovered, the neighbors he had rallied, or the plan he was building piece by piece. As he rose from the porch and walked back into the house, Daniel whispered to himself, "They think this is the end, but it's just the beginning." The hearing was coming, and with it the moment everything would change. The morning of the hearing arrived with a stillness that felt unnatural. The air was heavy, the sky a pale gray, as if the world itself held its breath. Daniel stood at the mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt. His reflection showed more than just exhaustion. It showed determination carved into every line of his face. Neighbors had gathered at his home before sunrise. The barn lights still glowed faintly, remnants of their late-night work the evening before. They had turned the place into more than a structure. It had become a symbol. When Daniel stepped onto his porch, he found Mr. Alvarez waiting, tool belt slung across his shoulder, as if he were preparing for battle. Mrs. Green held a folder of photographs, her cane in one hand and fire in her eyes. Families stood behind them, kids clutching handmade posters that read, "Save Our Home and History Matters." It was no longer just Daniel walking into the hearing. It was an entire community. The HOA office, polished and sterile, felt like enemy territory. The conference room was filled with sharp suits and colder stares. At the head of the long oak table sat Ms. Calloway, her expression as crisp as the papers stacked before her. She didn't look at Daniel when he entered. She looked past him, as if he were already dismissed. "Mr. Carson," she began, her voice steady, "this hearing will determine whether your property is in violation of HOA standards. You have been given ample notice and time. Do you wish to make a statement?" Daniel rose, the folder of documents in his hand, trembling slightly until he steadied it against the table. "Yes," he said. His voice, though quiet at first, grew stronger as he continued. "This house is not a violation. It is a part of this neighborhood's story. My parents built it, lived in it, and opened it to every person sitting behind me today. To tear it down would not be enforcing rules, it would be erasing history." He placed photographs across the table, the block parties under the oak tree, the barn dances, neighbors smiling with his parents. Each photo landed like evidence in a trial, undeniable and vivid. Gasps rose from the room as faces recognized themselves decades younger, laughing and carefree. But Ms. Calloway leaned forward, her lips curling into a cold smile. "History is sentimental. Rules are practical. The board must uphold standards, not memories." Before Daniel could respond, Mrs. Green rose from her seat. Her cane struck the floor with a sharp crack. "Standards?" she said, her voice trembling with anger. "I've lived here longer than any of you. That barn you call non-compliant is where my husband asked me to dance for the first time. Those shutters you call outdated were built by men who believed in neighbors helping neighbors. Don't you dare call that a violation." The room fell silent. One by one, more neighbors stood. The Thompsons spoke about how Daniel's father had fixed their roof after a storm. Others told stories of holidays spent at the Carson home, of kindnesses given freely without asking for anything in return. What began as a hearing turned into a chorus of voices, weaving together a history too powerful to ignore. Daniel looked at Ms. Calloway, expecting anger, but what he saw was worse. A flicker of panic, quickly masked by her practiced calm. She tapped her pen against her clipboard. "Enough!" she said sharply. "The board will deliberate." The members whispered among themselves, papers shuffled, pens scratched. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, Ms. Calloway stood. "The board has voted, the fines will stand, foreclosure proceedings will continue." The room erupted in outrage. Neighbors shouted, disbelief filling the air. Daniel felt his chest tighten, but then he remembered his notebook. Plan B. He reached into his folder and pulled out a final document, one he had held back until this very moment. "This," Daniel said, holding it up, "is proof that the Carson Ranch is listed in the county's Historic Preservation Registry. It was filed 20 years ago by my parents. That barn, that house, even the oak tree, they're protected as historical landmarks. You can't fine me for preserving what the law itself requires me to protect." The color drained from Ms. Calloway's face. The board members leaned forward, scanning the paper, their whispers growing frantic. The law was clear. Daniel's home wasn't just safe, it was untouchable. Gasps filled the room, followed by cheers. Mrs. Green clutched Daniel's hand with tears in her eyes. Mr. Alvarez slapped him on the back. Even the children shouted with joy, their posters waving high in the air. For the first time, Daniel allowed himself to breathe. The weight of weeks of fear and sleepless nights lifted from his shoulders. He had not only saved his home, he had honored his parents' legacy and reminded everyone of what community truly meant. As the neighbors poured out of the sterile office into the sunlight, Daniel paused at the door. He turned back once more, meeting Ms. Calloway's furious gaze. She had tried to break him, but instead, she had made him stronger. Later that evening, back at the ranch, the barn lights glowed warm against the twilight. Music played, children laughed, and neighbors gathered beneath the oak tree just as they had years ago. Daniel stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, his heart full. This fight had started as a battle for survival. It had ended as a victory for memory, community, and something far greater than himself. And as he watched the lights flicker in the barn, Daniel knew one truth with absolute certainty. The HOA had underestimated him. This wasn't just his home. This was his legacy, and no one would ever take it away again.